What is happening to Ukraine today is directly connected to the Budapest Memorandum of 1994. It was there that Ukraine gave up the nuclear weapons it had inherited after the collapse of the Soviet Union, in exchange for promises of security and non-aggression from the United States, the United Kingdom, and Russia. Looking at the consequences today, the Budapest Memorandum is often seen as a symbol of deception, or at the very least, political naivete. But over the past 30 years, this story has been buried under layers of myths, emotions, and verdicts passed in hindsight. And before talking about betrayal or mistake, there is a more important question to answer. What was actually promised, and what was really at stake in December 1994? The starting point of this story is June 16, 1990. On that day, Ukraine, still part of the Soviet Union, adopted a declaration of state sovereignty. This document is particularly important because of its 9th clause. In it, Ukraine declared its intention to become a permanently neutral, non-nuclear state in the future, not to accept, produce, or acquire nuclear weapons. On August 24, 1991, the Act of Declaration of Independence followed, legally formalizing Ukraine's withdrawal from the Soviet Union. Importantly, the document did not clearly define what Ukraine would do with the nuclear weapons located on its territory. The issue shifted from the ideological realm into a practical one. After the collapse of the USSR in December 1991, 4 independent republics inherited Soviet nuclear weapons: Russia, Kazakhstan, Belarus, and Ukraine. On Ukrainian territory, there were tactical nuclear weapons, strategic bombers, silo-based and mobile launchers for intercontinental ballistic missiles, as well as storage facilities containing nuclear warheads. In total, around 2,000 nuclear warheads were stationed in the country, the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world, larger than those of the United Kingdom, France, and China. But there is an important detail that is often overlooked. Even in theory, Ukraine could not control this arsenal. All command and control functions over the strategic nuclear forces remained in Moscow. Moreover, the Ukrainian government did not possess the launch codes for the missiles. Those were also held in Moscow. In other words, Ukraine found itself in a highly uncomfortable position. On one side, there was pressure from Russia, which was interested in the return of former Soviet nuclear weapons. On the other, there was pressure from the United States, the very country these missiles were still aimed at. And finally, there was Ukraine itself, hosting an arsenal it could not control and which required enormous financial resources to maintain. According to former Ukrainian President Leonid Kravchuk, Ukraine itself was also interested in transferring the strategic nuclear weapons to Russia, unwilling to remain a hostage to this situation. The decision to remove tactical nuclear weapons, the most mobile part of the arsenal, was formalized on December 21, 1991, in Alma-Ata, in the Agreement on Joint Measures Regarding Nuclear Weapons. By the spring of 1992, all tactical nuclear weapons from the territory of the former Soviet Union had been transferred to Russia. However, strategic nuclear weapons still remained. Their fate was decided in May 1992 with the signing of the Lisbon Protocol, an additional agreement to the START I treaty, signed by Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Belarus, and the United States. The protocol required Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine to eliminate their nuclear weapons as quickly as possible and to join the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons as non-nuclear states. It was at this moment that Ukraine's position began to shift. Initially, in its declaration of sovereignty, Ukraine had proclaimed its non-nuclear status partly out of concern that disputes over control of nuclear weapons could slow down the process of gaining independence. The memory of the Chernobyl disaster also played a significant role, but during the ratification of the Lisbon Protocol, that position no longer seemed so clear-cut. The signing of the protocol coincided with the first territorial claims by Russia against Ukraine, not in 2014 but in 1993, when the Russian parliament declared its claims to Sevastopol. As a result, Ukraine's representatives signed the treaty, but its ratification was rejected by the Ukrainian parliament. After the rather unsuccessful Lisbon summit, voices began to emerge, for the first time, among certain European politicians arguing that Ukraine should retain its nuclear arsenal as the only effective way to deter possible Russian aggression. Although these voices were in the minority, the majority, primarily representatives of the United States and Russia, pushed Kyiv toward transferring the arsenal to Moscow. At the same time, it would be inaccurate to say that Kyiv strongly resisted. Ukraine was prepared to give up its nuclear weapons, but, in exchange for transferring them to Russia, it demanded security guarantees and assurances of territorial integrity from the nuclear powers: Russia, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and China. Kyiv also requested financial compensation for adopting non-nuclear status, estimating it at $2.8 billion. On November 16, 1994, the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine adopted the law on Ukraine's accession to the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons of July 1, 1968. However, there was one important reservation. Article 6 of the law stated, "This law shall enter into force only after Ukraine receives security guarantees from the nuclear weapon states, formalized through the signing of an appropriate international legal document." The promised guarantees were formalized in the Budapest Memorandum, signed on December 5, 1994. The United States, the United Kingdom, and Russia undertook the following commitments: to respect Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and existing borders, to refrain from the threat or use of force against Ukraine's territorial integrity or political independence, not to use economic pressure to subordinate Ukraine to their own interests, to seek action in the UN Security Council if Ukraine became a victim of aggression involving nuclear weapons, not to use nuclear weapons against Ukraine, and to hold consultations in the event a situation arose affecting these commitments. The financial compensation for Ukraine was set at $500 million, instead of the $2.8 billion it had originally requested. Many historians and politicians, particularly those sympathetic to Ukraine, later described the memorandum as problematic, since it did not include binding defense obligations in the event of aggression. In the case of a nuclear attack, the guarantors merely pledged to appeal to the UN Security Council to provide assistance. And in the event of a situation affecting these commitments, they promised consultations. These formulations were a weak substitute for the firm security guarantees Ukraine had sought, but they were the maximum Ukrainian diplomats were able to secure after prolonged negotiations. However, it is more accurate to view the memorandum not from the perspective of the 2000s and 20s, but from that of 1994. At the time, its signing was perceived as a diplomatic success for Ukraine. The country received international recognition of its borders, the status of a responsible participant in the global security system, and its renunciation of nuclear weapons was seen as a step toward Europe and the West. In addition, Ukraine obtained political security assurances from the nuclear powers. And there is another important point. In 1994, there was no confrontation between Ukraine and Russia. On the contrary, they were regarded as friendly countries, closely integrated through family, cultural, and historical ties. Ukraine at that time seriously demanded security guarantees from both Russia and Western states. Overall, Kyiv considered the guarantees it received to be sufficient. In the 1990s, these agreements helped stabilize Ukraine's struggling economy and its statehood. Resolving the nuclear issue also contributed to stabilizing the situation in Crimea, as Boris Yeltsin had fewer arguments to support pro-Russian separatism there, and a stronger position to oppose such efforts within the Russian parliament. Between 1994 and 1996, nuclear warheads were gradually removed from Ukrainian territory. Missile silos that had housed intercontinental ballistic missiles were filled in or destroyed, and strategic bombers were dismantled. Some of these aircraft, instead of being scrapped, were transferred to Russia as partial repayment of Ukraine's gas debt, and some of them are likely still in service today. By mid-1996, Ukraine no longer possessed nuclear weapons and had officially become a non-nuclear state. For nearly 20 years, the very existence of the Budapest Memorandum was largely forgotten. For a simple reason: there were no direct military threats to Ukraine's territorial integrity. The document disappeared from media attention and became one of many little-known international agreements. The following 2 decades were relatively calm for Ukraine and the region as a whole, without major upheavals. Everything changed in February 2014. After Russian troops entered Crimea and the peninsula was subsequently annexed, Ukraine officially stated for the first time that Russia's actions violated the commitments undertaken under the Budapest Memorandum. The primary reference was to the provisions concerning respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the non-use of force. However, it quickly became clear that the parties attached fundamentally different meanings to the document. For Kyiv, the memorandum had always been seen as compensation for giving up nuclear weapons. Not a military alliance, but a political assurance that the country's borders would not be changed by force. Russia's interpretation was different and relied on a narrow legal reading of the document. Moscow argued that the Budapest Memorandum was not an international treaty and that it contained only political assurances rather than legally binding guarantees. The 2 other signatories, the United States and the United Kingdom, found themselves in the most difficult position. On the one hand, they acknowledged that Russia had violated both the spirit and the letter of the memorandum, and condemned Moscow for the invasion of Crimea. On the other hand, they emphasized that the memorandum did not include obligations of military intervention and was not equivalent to collective defense guarantees. Former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine Stephen Pfeiffer, who participated in the signing of the memorandum, put it this way: "In the English text of the memorandum, the word assurances appears, not guarantees. That is an important distinction. For example, our NATO allies have security guarantees. South Korea and Japan, with whom the United States has mutual defense treaties, also have guarantees. In the case of Ukraine, we are talking about assurances. That is a weaker term. Secondly, the memorandum did not specify a mechanism for response, except for appealing to the UN Security Council if nuclear weapons were used against Ukraine. For Ukraine and for Western countries, one of the most uncomfortable aspects of the memorandum was the realization that, in 2014, The Western states had formally fulfilled their obligations to Ukraine by holding the consultations provided for in the document. While the negative consequences for Ukraine were obvious, the problem for the West was different. After 2014, an uncomfortable question emerged in expert circles. If a country gives up nuclear weapons and still becomes a victim of aggression and loses part of its territory, why should other countries abandon them at all? This question was directed primarily at Iran and North Korea. At the time, it received no clear answer, and in many ways, it still does not. Another question, which also has no definitive answer, is whether Ukraine had any real alternatives in 1994 other than unilaterally giving up its nuclear arsenal. If Ukraine's position in 1994 can be described in one word, that word is zugzwang. In chess, zugzwang is a situation in which any possible move worsens your position, yet not making a move is impossible. Beyond pressure from both the United States and Russia, Ukraine lacked both the physical and financial capacity to maintain its nuclear arsenal. According to Ukraine's first president, Leonid Kravchuk, the nuclear warhead stationed on its territory had been manufactured in Russia and, as their service life expired, were scheduled to be returned there for dismantlement by 1997. The infrastructure associated with nuclear weapons was extremely costly. In 2021, Kravchuk estimated the cost of a single missile silo at $1 billion and the entire system at roughly $200 billion. Building new facilities in Ukraine simply to keep the system operational would have required an additional $65 billion. At the time, the Ukrainian government simply could not afford such expenditures. What if Ukraine had insisted on keeping its arsenal? This question is often asked in hindsight, implying that the mere possession of nuclear weapons would have automatically made any aggression impossible, and most likely that is true. But there are several important nuances. Had Ukraine refused to disarm, it would almost certainly have faced strong pressure from the United States and a cooling of relations with Europe. Sanctions would have been highly likely, and if the confrontation had continued, political isolation could have followed. It is also important to understand the context of the time. In the early 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Ukraine was seen as a country with enormous potential. Many, both within Ukraine and in the West, believed it had a promising future in the near term. At that moment, it was Ukraine, not Russia, that was often viewed as the potential leader of the post-Soviet space. A country without major ethnic or political conflicts, with fertile land, a developed industrial base, a moderate climate, and a favorable geographic position. In such circumstances, there was little desire to enter into open confrontation with the United States and the West. This is why framing the decision as simply right or wrong oversimplifies reality. Ukraine was not choosing between security and naivety. It was choosing between two unfavorable scenarios. And the answer to the central question, whether Ukraine was betrayed, remains debated to this day. In many ways, it lies not in the realm of international law, but in the realm of emotion.